All right, hi everybody. This is Kubernetes SIG architecture meeting for June 25th. Um, we have a few items on the agenda, so I think Dan, you were up first. Do you want to share anything, or should I share the agenda?
You can share the agenda. Yeah, I don't have
Okay.
any visuals.
Okay.
Um, okay. So I started this KEP a little before 1.37, but people are still discussing it and it missed all of the deadlines. So it's for 1.38 now, I guess. But the idea is that in SIG network, we like most of the SIGs, when you define a feature, you implement that feature yourself and then you say, okay, let's make it conformance. And in SIG network, pretty much all the time, we define a feature, but then third parties have to implement it in pod network implementations and service proxies and cloud load balancers. And we have no process for declaring things required for conformance or even really required at all. There's a chart in the text of actually, if you click that link right at the bottom there, where you just were. Um, so I came up with a list of all of the features that SIG Network has defined since we started the KEP process, where part of the feature has to be implemented by an out-of-tree component, and how widely implemented they are. And the little smiley faces give a sort of, feelings about that. Of the ones listed there are 19, and endpoint slices are the only one that were universally implemented, except then we realized that's not true. They're pretty much universally implemented among service proxies, but not among service DNS implementations. Kube DNS never got endpoint slice support. So we have this thing, we keep defining stuff and most people implement it and most people have access to it in their clusters, but not everybody. And I wanted to try and come up with a process for being able to start requiring these without saying, oh, hey, Cilium and Ovi and Kubernetes, you have to implement this by next month. Because that's essentially what adding it to conformance would do. It's an immediate requirement that they get these things implemented. So the idea is that we start marking tests as future conformance and say, as of 1.40, passing this test will be required for conformance. Um, and I started this as a SIG network thing because it affects us the most. And Ben suggested that maybe I ought to make it a SIG architecture uh, KEP really with, a SIG network assist. I'm not sure if there are other SIGs that have this problem or would benefit from this idea, but so that's a general idea. David?
Yeah, I think my quest I like the idea of somewhere for people to know where their CNI falls on a spectrum of supportability. Why would this be in kube conformance versus something like networking conformance? And then so you'd be able to see like such and such as network conformant, since it does seem distinct and a plugin.
How does it seem distinct?
Um, every cube conformance thing I can think of is fully implemented in Cube. And so if
Ha!
this was network conformant, then you would then
So
be able to say, given a network conformant implementation, it is now required for cube conformance to pass this.
so I already answered this objection in the notes that I put there. Service DNS has always been required for conformance and has never been implemented in tree. So
Aha.
we have
I
all
stand corrected.
um, and for that matter, there's currently no pod networking implementation in tree. So if pod networking is required for conformance, then you need something out of tree. So
Okay.
Right. So there are basic that conformance tests do cover like very basic service um, functionality, like so service networking functionality, which obviously, well, generally requires pod networking functionality. And so I think there is a precedent for at least the very basics being covered. And I mean, these are features that are GA API controlled via GA APIs in um, Kubernetes, but we never did, for example, make policy part of like a lot of things, things that are optional features. And I guess that's the deciding factor. Is like can we make these not optional without knocking out a whole bunch of distributions from conformance? So I jumped the line. Sorry. Go ahead. I think I don't know who's first.
I think I was.
Yeah.
So the yeah, I mean the other thing is we don't have we don't have any other official conformance programs. It's a whole thing to get that spun up with the CNCF. I think it's pretty important that we're able to say, we're going to raise the baseline for what's included out of things that are defined in core, even if some of it's implemented out. I mean, you can also argue similarly for like new pod functionality that you have to implement in the container runtime. It's entirely possible that like cry docker d is not conformant when we add something to pod, and we need to be able to do that. I think there's a more general problem though, that we don't have a very good pattern for. This is aimed at being a conformance test, and then we just kind of promote them and review and see if it's reasonable. I think it would be really useful to have a way to distinguish, this is intended to be a conformance test. We have a problem where for
Thought we
any
added
feature,
that. Oh, I thought we added that a while back. I thought I remember
we're
early
not,
on.
no, we don't have any active mechanism for that.
Okay.
You can tag things as like this is a test for a beta feature. We have robustness for that, but that doesn't say will it be, do we aim for it to be a
A
conformance test?
provisional conformance test. I thought
Yeah.
that the
And then
II guys added that at some point.
if they did, we're not using that anywhere.
Okay.
It's not a thing currently. And we should really have some dedicated CI for that as well, so that when you go to promote it, we're like, okay, we know that this is robust. It's been passing well. There's already some consensus that you're promoting, that you're planning for this to be provisional. And I think that should go through the conformance approvers. So I'm fully supportive of this. I think we need this. The only question I have is I think framing it as a SIG network thing is like that's where we're feeling the pain point the most, but we probably should use the same mechanism for all provisional conformance tests. And probably a lot of beta features should be thinking about this.
Yeah, I think I am next. I have couple of points. First, and both kind of continuation of what Ben said. First, we do have other conformance programs. We have AI conformance, and as part of AI conformance, we were trying to define like how the array should behave, and like, we also have device plugins which are really deprecated, but they still need to behave a certain way and like react on certain API calls specific way. Like I wonder if this is aligned with third-party components. Do we want to do like plugins test as well, or it's different? Like I'm just not very familiar with how like what SIG network will be testing on these components. Like, is it mostly API fields, or it's behavior when you like have different way to operate on those fields? So like yeah, if you can shed some lights like how it's different from the array plugin, for instance, it will be very interesting. And second point is like runtime conformance was always hard to analyze because runtime conformance is very dependent on like specific features on runtime, and like conformance is mostly checking API fields. I wonder if it will be a problem for networking as well. Like with the plugins, it's likely not a distinct behaviors that you can analyze. Like you change this field and this field reacted this way, or like pod is restarted because of that. I wonder how easy it will be to test those fields without going very deep into how this component is tweaked node configuration, network configuration.
So early, like the early versions of conformance, like didn't check the service functionality, and we did add that years and years ago, like that it actually makes sure that the service like the different types of services to behave in the way, well, not load balancers because we can't test those in conformance, but behave in the way. So you can do it because the APIs have a certain semantic associated with them, at least to a certain level. But I mean, it's a massive project, honestly, to do like this plugin level. The only group I think that's done it is Gateway. I think Gateway does it pretty well. So and Dan, I'm sure you are more familiar with that than I am. Like, can we learn from their example? I always kind of hope to learn from their example. and try and bring some of that back to the other plugin interfaces.
Um, yeah, I don't I'm not super involved with the gateway side of things. And I don't know if they would do it all the way that they did again. Like they've certainly learned that some of the things they initially did were bad ideas, like the experimental versus standard and the way that they implemented that. So um, yeah, I don't know. I did put a note at the end of this about while I was thinking about the out of tree conformance stuff, like the idea of, we have no conformance for dual stack or cloud load balancers or clusters with RBAC enabled or things like that, right? Like we want to be able to say, if you're going to enable this feature or if you have a cluster where this feature is available, it ought to work this way, and we can't do that either. And that's sort of a separate problem, but
Right. Yeah,
also
we looked at
would be very
addressing
cool.
that, but we never. Yeah, and what kind of having gone through this, and sorry, Dim, you've had your hand up a long time, but like it all sounds great, but it's really hard to invest the resources to build elaborate conformance frameworks. And so we've just been sort of skating by with this very basic, you know, um,
Right. And so I tried to keep this simple. It's just,
yeah,
we tag certain tests as in 4 releases, this will be conformance. Now you know. And then
right.
that's
That
basically
that
the
that
whole
is
thing.
pretty simple. Yeah, it's a provisional model. So I think DIMS has been waiting a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. So another other than the gateway, the other one that I can think of is the CSI folks. They do some amount of testing of their CSI driver too. The thing that I worry about is like when one vendor, say Broadcom, is trying to qualify their distro and they are using Cilium and they have no control over Cilium, and like the Cilium stuff fails, then these guys can't claim conformance, right? So there is that kind of patterns where they're not responsible for it, but they use it and it doesn't work, and like they have to go find something else to qualify with, and then they'll have to change the documentation to say, oh, the qualified conformance version is with Calico, but then we tell you to use Cilium because Cilium is better or whatever, right? Like, so then it becomes like a problematic. So just before conformance, they'll do something sort of thing. Yeah.
So,
Did you-
and that's why I wanted to make it be you have a year or 2 years to implement this before it becomes part of conformance. So Cilium can see right away this is going to be needed later, and they can start working on it.
Or they can come to us and argue that it shouldn't
Right.
be. Yeah.
Right.
I think there are
Dims, this is also,
where people didn't want to do some stuff that we told them to do. So,
but this is already a problem. Like I said, like something like the container runtimes is a good example. There's like most vendors are not invested in those, but choose wisely. Make sure you're picking one that is well maintained and going to keep up with these
Right.
things, because we do add and require new functionality. Sometimes it's not done through conformance, but we've ship breaking changes and said, hey, you have to implement this in the container runtime or it's just not going to work in the future.
Yeah.
So I think that's fine, and we need a way to be able to say these things are baseline. We can spin up another program like we did with AI conformance. I think that one's different because those are things that are explicitly not expected that every cluster is going to do. Well, these are things that we really think that every cluster should be doing, and the moment we start adding variations on that, we're just confusing users and devaluing the program.
Yeah.
We also already only conformance verify a specific configuration, and a lot, like I think most of the managed products, it's like you need to turn it on this way. If you turn on like GK autopilot, then it's not.
Then I had two more points. So hang on with me, and I'll yield after that. So the next one was, we can take it as like a two-step process. We can write the tests, host them somewhere, just like the CSI and the gateway, and we can in our CI/CD jobs, like we already have things like. Cilium and things like that are running. So we can add more variations for networking and like collect the information, and like we can publish saying that, look, here is our test suite, here is the versions of these drivers, and here is where we want them to do more work, right? And so we can do that ourselves without actually and give the feedback to the the people who are maintaining the network stuff. Excuse me. Sorry. So that would be like the first step, right? Like get ourselves going and make sure that the tests are good and we like what we are doing and things like that. And then we can see if we can put it in one of the existing conformance program or create a new one. The problem with creating a new one is CNCF, we'll have to bring in CNCF, and that becomes a big thing, and they will want to know what is this for, and what does it help, and how does it promote some of the things that you're trying to do. And so the point is we'll have to justify that program because CNCF has to staff those kinds of things, right? So if we try to slide it into the existing conformance program, even then there is some cost associated with that in terms of you were talking about provisional and things like that, right? So there is also some automation and things like that that they have to modify on their end. And so there is some amount of cost to doing it, and we can evaluate whether we want to do it once we have an idea of what is our test and how good people are, and are we making progress over time in getting the different vendors to implement all the things that we want them to implement. And then once we have okay, 5 out of 7 are good, and that covers 80% of the thing, then we'll say, hey, let's slide it into the regular conformance program sort of thing. But the main important thing is we need the tests, and we need those tests to be rock solid over a period of time, and we have to augment the tests and see how that goes. That was my stream of consciousness. Sorry about that.
Okay, well, I think we've spent all the time we should on this, but it sounds like, Dan, people are generally aligned, but maybe we start with the tests and we look into adding a provisional mechanism, and that's probably as much effort as we want to put into building more out.
Yeah.
Okay, I think yours is the next topic as well, so if you can move to that.
Yep, this was just another spin-off from the same KEP. So Ben and somebody else had started working on something to flag KEPs when people didn't fill out every single field of the PRR that was required at that stage of the KEP. And I pointed out that makes no sense for this KEP because it's not adding a feature that runs inside Kubernetes clusters where you can ask things like what happens when you do rollback, or are there metrics? And lots of SIGs have had this same problem, and we just got talking about, should there be a clearer process for using the KEP process for things that aren't features that run in a Kubernetes cluster, or should we encourage people to not use KEPs for those sorts of things?
So what we've talked about this a bit in the past, and actually just again on the theme of trying to keep it simple, maybe we add a field in kep.yaml that says, non-feature KEP or something to give it a different setup of tooling that applies to it and bypass a lot of the trouble. We talked about having different templates and all this stuff, but it just, again, it's like people have too many things that they're doing. Tim?
I was going to say mostly that same thing. At some point, we talked about having different KEP templates for different kinds of changes, ecosystem changes, policy changes, and then feature changes. So it's a butt ton of work to go do that. Nobody's stepped up to go write a new template. And honestly, the current template is showing its age in a lot of ways. It could use a total revamp, in my opinion. I'm fine personally with just saying NA all over the place as a fast path.
That's what we do now. Yeah.
And PRR approvers typically work pretty quickly with you for yep, we see it, approve. Because policy KEPs are actually not rare. I guess SIG-ARC doesn't work the others, but
there's a few every cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's genuinely tedious and discourages people from writing KEPs to make decisions, though. I really think we should just fork the template, say this is a process or a policy KEP, and drop those fields. I don't think that's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's really tricky to encourage people to whom all these questions don't apply to just say, like, make it clear to them, like, you can just say NA to all this stuff. That's totally fine because none of this applies to you. It's hard to say that in the same template where we really don't want people to put just NA if they're delivering code that they should be thinking through. Like, it's hard to have a paragraph that encourages some people to completely ignore the section and other people like definitely don't ignore this section.
The other thing is I've done lots of KEPs before where half of the PRR is NA because of the nature of the KEP, but some of the PRR questions are still very relevant. And I felt like answering NA to every single question obscures the fact that the entire PRR is irrelevant. Like, it would have been much more obvious if I could just delete the whole section rather than having to answer NA to every single question.
Yeah, the one problem here, Dan, is like, people end up going from PR to KEP, right? Like, they'll open up a PR and we'll say, no, this needs a KEP. So, they go open a KEP and now they have two choices and they'll pick the simpler one, right? And then we'll say, no, not this KEP. You have to use the full one. And like, then it becomes like a problem between like making people do work. If for the people who know, it's easy, right? Like, so we know which, if it's you or me, then we'll know which one to pick. If somebody is coming from the community, they typically probably don't know, right? Like, that's why they ended up doing a PR first. So there is that problem as well. I agree with Tim about like revamp and things like that. And maybe as part of the revamp, we can have additional language, or maybe we can even add now additional language to like which if it's a policy only KEP, then ignore these rest of the things. And like, we can also augment the YAML. It's mostly as a signal to not just the author, but also like, what does a release team need to do, right? Like, so it's a signal to the rest of the release process that is going on too. It's not just for the author to file the thing, because there is stuff happening to track the KEP and things like that. So maybe we can do some small stuff right now to make it easier for some of us who are doing these sorts of KEPs. But yeah, we'll have to figure out like the larger question of a full KEP revamp, and I don't think we are ready for that right now.
So Dibs, are you saying you don't think we should have two KEP templates, and we should just do the update of the metadata to say?
Yeah, we update the metadata now, and then we'll do a revamp at some point.
What do you think, Ben? You're the one advocating right now for
I really think that we can start with just a direct copy. I think optimizing for you have no experience in the community and you're writing a KEP is a much bigger problem than this. Don't think I've ever seen anybody show up to Kubernetes and start by writing a KEP and have that go well without a lot of hand holding to begin with. They don't know how to fill any of this out as is. I don't think we should block on that aspect. That we have approvers for the folders for a reason.
I totally agree that the KEP process is cumbersome and actually inhibits people from using it right now. Like, that's a totally different topic, and we need a sacrificial person to go and tilt at that windmill. But newcomers to the project probably shouldn't be writing a KEP as their first contribution, and they're probably not writing policy-oriented KEPs anyway. Yeah. So, like, yes,
Tim, they will pick this template over the other template. That is a problem.
Well, sure, and then we'll say no. You have code changes. This is the wrong template. So that actually gets even worse, right? But I do think the KEPs are about 3x longer than they need to be.
Okay, well, maybe where we start is, Ben, since you seem to be volunteering yourself, if you want to put together a PR and we'll take a look at it, and it sounds like then we can discuss it on there. In the interest of time, we have other agenda items here.
Yeah, I'm happy to propose something.
Thank you. All All right, Tim Allclair. Do you want to share anything or just?
No, I don't think we need to. Yeah, I imagine a lot of folks here have already seen some of the discussion on dynamic containers. But just to kind of catch everyone up, or if anyone hasn't seen the proposal, so dynamic containers is a proposal to make the containers field in the pod spec, the main containers, not init containers or ephemeral containers, make the main containers field mutable. This isn't making the container spec itself fully mutable, but we want to make it so you can add and remove containers from there. This will be done behind a new sub-resource, and the new sub-resource is going to allow all the existing mutations. And the messaging that we want to give around the new sub-resource is that do not assume that anything is immutable through this sub-resource. So it's kind of a future-looking change, but we want to make sure that any policy that's applied to this assumes that anything could, in the future, potentially change. We're not making the pod fully mutable behind the sub-resource, but we want to get that message across. There was a bunch of discussion around trying to get this into 137, and ultimately we decided not to merge it into 137. I would like to get an alpha into 138, ideally getting the KEP pre-approved before then. And so I think discussing here at SIG architecture is sort of the first step in that. And then I think just to add one more thing, I think the main thing that we're looking to have discussion on and get agreement from in SIG architecture is kind of less about some of the implementation details and more the motivation. Is this a problem we want to solve? Is making pods more mutable the approach that we want to take? Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Yeah, we've had a lot of discussion. So, David, you wanna jump in?
Yeah. So I know that there was some contention on the PR originally. I am, for my part, glad that we kept it open for comment. I did see some comments a couple different times started in the thread asking, does this really get to the latency that's desired? And I can't speak for the person's use case, but one of the last couple commenters were saying, like, there's different features that I would like more. That doesn't mean that we don't build this one, but I'm trying to understand where you see that fit. Were you expecting this to solve those problems? Were you not expecting this to solve those problems?
Yeah, I think so right now we sort of have two approaches to scheduling work in Kubernetes. There's push everything down to the application framework layer. So this is like what Kubernetes does, what some other new frameworks are doing, where kind of we re-implement all the job scheduling and whatnot in the application layer. And that will always be kind of potentially the fastest, lowest latency approach. We're cutting the Kubernetes control plane and kubelet out entirely. So if you build for speed and drop a lot of the Kubernetes features, you can potentially get the lowest latency there. At the other end of the spectrum, we have creating a new pod for each workload. And there you're getting the full advantage of the Kubernetes ecosystem and tooling around it, and it's slower. And so like we're sort of building, we want to build for all three of these at the same time, essentially. Like we want to keep making pods faster to start up and run. And we want to keep making features available to application frameworks to manage jobs better within a container, essentially. And the bet that dynamic containers, or more generally dynamic pods, is making is that there is a use case and demand for inserting something in between. Dynamic containers will always be faster than creating new pods and probably always be slower than doing something entirely at the framework level. But we think that there's advantages to getting some of the Kubernetes ecosystem without the full weight of creating pods there. Does that answer the question?
Maybe. It sounds like you didn't expect this to satisfy it, but well, I thought at least one of these
Well,
overlapped. I'll double
if I
check to
can-
see if it
I
actually
think there's
overlapped
a
with one where
wait.
you had
There's a
listed
there's
it, and then the person said this doesn't help me. So I'll double check to be sure that's what I saw.
If I could jump the line and just add
Yeah.
to it in case folks know me, I'm Andrew. I used to work on Cube, now I work on Ray and lead the Cube Ray project. So from the Ray perspective, as Tim mentioned, like a lot of people choose to use Ray because it does more like process level orchestration with tasks and actors that provide millisecond latency for new workers. So like for large scale distributed training and inference, like that the millisecond latency is really important. But an emerging pattern that we are seeing in Ray is that there is a stronger need to run those distributed processes, those tasks and actors, in a more isolated manner. And this is largely driven by frontier RL, where like let's say you're training a coding model and the coding model like generates some code during inference, and then you want to like actually run the code and evaluate the output. So like you need to somehow like execute this code in some sandbox environment, right? So like this is an example where like you can't just like run the code execution inside the Ray process, because that could compromise the whole cluster if it's running some code that is not safe to run. And then in general, like long-lived agents that run on Ray is also another use case where this type of workflow is going to be more common. And so we are seeing this like emerging pattern where like people want like the latency that Ray provides, but they also want more isolation, and they're willing to sacrifice some latency to get better isolation. But they don't want to like go through the whole like kube scheduler process as well. And like a concerning pattern that we're seeing is that some users will just say like, I'm just going to use like Docker and Docker. So like my Ray actor is going to call Docker and like run the container. And like for many reasons, like we don't want people doing Docker and Docker in Ray. And then like the alternative to that is like they just say like, okay, like Ray on Cube is too complex. I'm just going to offload the sandbox entirely to like a separate infrastructure that runs on VMs. And like that's a different, like obviously we don't want that either. Like we want the sandbox running on Cube as well. So like dynamic containers, like at least from the Ray perspective, kind of is like a good middle ground where we can provide like much lower latency to like start actors in isolated containers without sacrificing like other things that Ray provides. But yeah, I'll stop there. But just wanted to add 2 cents from the Ray perspective.
Thanks, Andrew. I think Mo had his hand up yet next, but I'm wondering if it's a different. Oh, that's okay. Okay.
Yeah, I'll go quick. So what I'm trying to understand is why do we think that we will be successful with trying to sort of push this sort of high frequency change through our API, right? Like foundationally, like, I don't think that's what the Kube API is designed to tolerate, right? Am I mistaken in my belief here? Right? Like, even if you get the latency trade-off to one that you're happy with, nothing's going to dramatically make etcd faster to keep up with the change rate that we're talking about here, right? So I'm just confused as to why we believe we should be in this business in the first place. Like, I don't think you need Cube to be in the loop to get the stronger isolation. I think you can do that with C groups and other approaches. Right. So I'm struggling to understand what the full user story is here.
So if it's okay, I'll speak to that a little bit. Most recently, in the last couple of months, I've been paying attention to one of these ecosystem projects that is trying to do something very similar to what Andrew's describing. And we find ourselves having to work around parts of Kubernetes. I know that Ray's been doing this for a long time, and now I'm sort of internalizing the pain a little better. Mo, I agree with you. Like, the Kubernetes as a system, the API was not designed to be operating in the single digit millisecond range. It was designed for sort of, by comparison, long-lived things that start quickly, but quickly being measured in order of seconds. And that led to a lot of decisions around Kubernetes of fully asynchronous everything and eventual coordination. And some of those decisions are really hard to unwind. But I will also say that the world writ large is moving in this direction where we need to respond more quickly, where we need to provide stronger isolation between things. And I think we would be remiss to not try to rise to that challenge. And so I'm supportive of trying to solve these problems at the Kubernetes level, because I would much rather not rebuild parts of Kubernetes that I'm having to do right now. And so my support for this project is, like, we owe it to ourselves and to everybody who uses Kubernetes to try to rise to this. Maybe we can't solve it, or maybe we can only solve it partially. But I think on that spectrum of performance and latency versus isolation, there are a number of like ticks on the spectrum, and we can do better than we're doing now, even if we can't get all the way to like Ray's level of single microsecond rescheduling.
Before we go on to the next thing, just want to, so a question for you then, Tim H, not Tim A, because it's going to get real confusing. Do you have, based on your current experience, a sense that this is actually a change that should be done through the pod API? So let me be very clear on my question. Say we do rise to the challenge of the problem. Does a solution have to go through that API? Right? Like, that's like my core foundational concern with this.
Sure, I get it. No, of course not. It's just software. We can do anything we want. But realistically, the pod API is a fairly well understood thing, as much baggage as it brings with it. And I think that I think we've missed an opportunity in Kubernetes overall to say who's responsible for which parts of the overall system. And I think it's a reasonable thing to say, hey, you know what? Local decisions about the pod can be delegated to the pod within some constraints. And I know that we have, admission hooks invalidate what I just said, right? The ability for a cluster admin to say, you know what? You can't use container images that end in a Y. If I'm allowed to change that at the kubelet level without validating, like, does that break those rules? I don't know. Let's go figure that out together. If that ultimately results in something that's different than pod, I think the ripple effect of that will be significant.
Yeah, I mean, the way I'm just mentally processing this whole thing is that there's if you want something very quick that's sort of node local, then sure, maybe that's a declared intent on the pod, but from that point on, just let the kubelet manage it and the API server stays out of the loop.
I think it's exceedingly weird to have the kubelet's understanding of a thing be different from the API server's understanding of a thing. Like,
I mean, but that's always been true. The kubelet's allowed to do anything it wants and not report it back.
well, I mean, allowed to and does are different things. And mostly we have a lot of status on pods that come back to tell us what's going on, right? Sorry, I want to cede the floor and let the other hands go.
Can I cut a line and answer the most question? I think that you are asked really right question, but this model actually it is. I don't want to just tie the two couple to the Ray, but Ray gave me the real use cases, right? So when I first talked to them 2 years ago, there's the actual no of the latency requirement. So startup, it doesn't mean like those the no latency also is short living of the process. So they are actually a lot of times tied together, but also sometimes actually it's not tied together. So they also have like they want like the no latency of the startup. They don't want to go through of the kubelet control, and then they want no code execution, but they run longer. With the current model, we still support of the race, like the still schedule of the task, which is short living. And the way it is, what we are talking about here is the longer running of the actor and make the Kubernetes more power. And another thing it is, even for if you notice that there are also another use cases, which it is not what we are focused on right now, right? So for agentic, another use cases, it is migration, right? So for the training jobs, and also for the inference jobs. So you want off like the still of the startup latency for the reduce of the time of the recovery, right? So you want to prepare about the resource and the resource envelope, remote node. Then you can check a point. You check a point. This one inform after you can migrate of the things. This one is actually really work with like another effort. I think at the KubeCon, we present of the eviction request of API, right? So for those kind of things, how we help of the inference work, which it is want to have the new of the minimize the disruption latency. So, but at the same time, we don't want to preserve all those expensive of the accelerator, right? So when you lead it and shut down, and then you migrate off those workload. So that's kind of the things, long-term things. This is open a lot of use cases and optimize Kubernetes for the new workloads. I just want to explain to you here because I don't want to tie it with like the only like the couple second process. We still support those kind of things. This is why Signal make that readable C group to support those use cases. But there's the other use cases.
I don't necessarily think I fully understood what you said, but I think from what you said, I don't think I heard a justification for where writable containers fits into what you said. But I don't necessarily want to get stuck here and let others go.
Well, let's let Tim. I think Tim was also raised his hand to address your question. So let's see.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I just wanted to add from what Tim and Don already said is this isn't meant to be a complete solution right here. This is a building block. And so we're building one piece of that at the node level. There's also a lot of work going on in scalability in API machinery. And we're exploring different options for how to make the churn on the pod scale better. And so I don't think we need to address that in the same cap. Yeah, if you're trying to rapidly add and remove containers from pods in a large scale cluster, you're going to start hitting, you're going to hit bottlenecks and problems. But this is kind of unblocking part of the use case, and we can kind of continue scaling or continue working on the scale separately from that.
I mean, I think that to me, the kind of thing that convinced me that there's value here, certainly at least in alpha, is that, it's that spectrum, right? It's the spectrum and the choice between latency and isolation. And for example, Mo, if you took and you just implemented this at the kubelet level so that it just didn't go through the API server and you could locally remove and add containers, you would lose all those, all those policies that the administrator might put in place, right? That your webhooks and everything. So
So I
you
don't
know,
think that's necessary. It doesn't have to be that way though, right? Like you can bridge it depending on how you shape the system, right?
yeah, you could, but at that point, you're adding in a bunch of latency. Like, I don't see how the API server is the bottleneck at that point, because probably all those, like, you're going to implement, VAP and everything. Like, it seems like you're just re-implementing the same functionality on the kubelet layer. So, like, it, the spectrum of choice between latency and isolation, um, I think has value, and there will be use cases that fall into different layers of the spectrum where they can make a choice. That's I find that you may disagree. I find that to be a reasonable reason to explore a new feature.
I guess,
David?
do you see this? Sorry, David. Just
Oh.
like in my mind, what I understood so far is, it's effectively being proposed that this be a default off global feature that has to be opted in at the cluster level, and then therefore it foundationally isn't part of conformance. So I'm just, the
I
whole
think
thing
what
seems real
Derek
weird
had
to me.
suggested, was, I mean, I think that's up for debate in the CAP, right? But like, I think what Derek had suggested was it's a field on the pod that says whether it can be mutated, which makes it so it's like even that doesn't seem strictly necessary because it's a sub resource, but it also kind of makes it easy to observe a pod and say, oh, could it ever change or not, right? And it so for clients that aren't
Opt-in, right?
expecting, it's opt-in on a per pod level, not on a per cluster level.
Right, pod level.
David?
Yeah. So I guess I wanted to answer that because I knew, or wanted to ask my question way back when. Thank you, Andrew, for clarifying. Thank you, Tim, since you were both here. I also wanted to be sure that it looked to me like on the KEP we had gotten pretty good engagement from several SIGs that thought they were involved. Tim tried to convince them they weren't involved. I'm not sure, or required to change. I'm not sure how convinced they were or not. A couple that stood out to me were the projects around autoscaling that seem to still have concerns about this and about vertical pod autoscaling. It would be great to try to help them along to where they need to be, especially if you're looking for wider adoption. That was something I'm happy to see in the CAP. My week did not go as planned. I will find time next week to look and drop comments that'll be very similar to the ones I mentioned in SIG off, Tim. So if you've already dealt with some of those, they're going to be around things like beta criteria, where it is, I want to be sure that in alpha we gather metrics about how many of our extension points are correctly set up to handle this new sub resource before it goes beta and on by default. And I'd like to have some kind of threshold that we see in our fleets to say, yes, we are there or we are not. Because what I don't want to have happen, we've had in the past boundaries where something big changes. And at least at Red Hat, we see the fleet stall on those. Probably one of the more recent ones, well, one of the biggest ones was CRD v1 beta 1. I don't know how many people have that burned into their memory, but that was a huge boundary, and I would definitely like to avoid that here.
Yeah, I will update the CAP to include more participating SIGs that we've discussed. And yeah, I'm also working on an update to how admission control will be handled, following up on what we discussed in the SIG auth meeting. I'm still working out a few of the details on that, which is why I haven't pushed the update yet. But that will definitely be addressed as well.
Okay, thank you. There was one other thing that came up in the call, and it was this functionality. Does it make sense to be opt-in only per pod, or does it make sense to also be opt-in per cluster? Where you think about the kubelet flags like debug handlers. There's a permanent flag to disable debug handlers, and lots of banks in particular like to turn that on, or turn that off rather, so the debug handlers are off. I can definitely imagine many banks for most of their clusters desiring this to be fully off, and giving them a flag to do so seems pretty reasonable. And for compatibility reasons, you could justify actually having it be opt-in instead of opt-out. At least consideration of what that looks like and why or why not.
I think we should discuss it, but it's also if it's a sub resource, you can just have no permissions on that. So it seems
that's the easy part, right? Yeah. Yeah. So
no
Tim,
one
last thing
is not there.
I think that's a good thing to discuss and figure out, like the per pod indicator, and then like existing policies we have, like pod security admission. Like we have 3 levels. Like, will those interact with this at all? Would we say like if you're going to be like fully mutable, you need to be privileged, or is this orthogonal? So like at least discussing it and say yes or no or why not, and then a cluster level opt in or opt out, or like which direction do we go? I think a way to say at the cluster level, this feature is off. I don't want this in my cluster. That seems reasonable. Like which way we default, I don't know. I haven't thought about it.
Yeah, Tim Alcala said it's an implementation detail. I agree. So Tim, one other thing that I think I mentioned before, like I know you're doing a lot of things, but like how can people help you, right? Like, so if we can do like an umbrella issue, that things that we can do now in 137 when we have some time, when you're chewing on it, I think that'll help, so that you're not doing this alone, sort of thing. So please consider that. Even if the KEP is not merged, there's a few things you mentioned that you wanted to do, and see how we can open that up to different folks who are interested in this work. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Mo, we have only a few minutes left. I think the other topics are going to have to go to next session. So because there's too much to cover in 4 minutes, so we can continue this till the end. Mo.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so like, I guess I, in a sense, remain unconvinced that the shape of this is through the pod API. So where is the venue to have the discussion about like how the thing is actually implemented?
I'd say
I would put it on the KEP, like, and as the use cases get more specific, like we want to enable this, we're trying to solve this. Like if there are alternative ways of solving those use cases, like suggesting them, or like what about this? What about this? Like, would that work? Those are great conversations to have, and often we will try to capture those in like alternatives considered. And so if there's a better way, like feel free to like have that conversation. That's a great conversation to have.
Right. And like if there are specific things we want to talk about related to like kubelet, we can open up an agenda item there, and auth, you already talked once.
So, I think the more concrete the use cases are, like we're trying to solve this problem, like here's the flow, here's the interaction, this is what we're trying to solve. The more concrete we have those, the better we can evaluate. Like if the pod was mutable, it would solve it this way. If there was a different object or a different flow, but we still needed it to be visible to policy, what would that look like? Would it satisfy that? We can evaluate it more concretely.
Right, Tim.
Yeah, sort of a similar question to Mo's. In terms of next steps here, do we need a follow-up SIG architecture discussion. Do we feel like we can move a
I
lot
think
to
that
the
the,
cap?
the goal
Oh.
the goal here, I think we moved it to the cap. The goal here was to make sure that there's broad awareness. And I think that, you said you'd add more participating caps, going to those cap meetings, making sure people go there. I don't think we necessarily need a follow-up unless, there's some other architectural considerations. I think the biggest thing was like, right, it's a big change to make pods all of a sudden mutable. And, so we need to have that broad discussion. So
I wouldn't mind if you come back in a month or two and like give us an update, right? Like that'll be good to have for sure.
Andre?
Yeah, actually, I have a quick question. I have like a little bit of time.
I think
Yeah, I
we'll
think
close this
yeah.
topic. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Do we have like two minutes, John?
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of like, just want to double check. I guess like, use case perspective definitely makes sense, to isolate RL environments or also separate, pods and containers. So we see similar things on, the hyperparameter tuning for evaluation, strategies when we require to have, more, dynamic workloads. I kind of like want to understand from your team, we're talking about we will never achieve the same latency by, working with kubescaler on pods. Like, do we really see this, just won't be possible to achieve the same latency? Do we have like strong limitations on the kube side to ensure we kind of have the same capabilities, but not the containers, but on the pod level? Because the problem that I see if we go to this road, maybe users in the future will require, fault tolerance, other capabilities on the container side, which won't be possible without, making them as a separate pods.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there will still be some use cases for separate pods. I considered a lot before opening this KEP whether we should just be investing more heavily into making pods faster. And even if we had scheduler fast path and warm pool sandboxes and just bypass everything so pod creation is instantaneous, there's still the problem of if an application requires application level initialization. So things that init containers do, pulling in volumes, pulling in devices, setting up those devices, all that stuff is kind of out of Kubernetes control, and we can't bypass all of that. And so the idea here is you could have your shell pod execution environment essentially set up and ready to receive the workloads there.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, we are out of time. Thank you, everybody, and look forward to see more updates on the KEP. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.